Welcome to Global Facts. Please subscribe and hit the bell icon for more breaking updates. I bet you didn't know that a single grain could spark a trade war between nations. Tonight, we're tracking a story that's about far more than food. It's a battle over culture, science, and billions in trade. At the center, corn, Mexico's ancient grain and national symbol. Mexico, birthplace of corn, has rejected genetically modified corn from the US, igniting a trade standoff and opening the door for Canada. The shockwaves stretch from Iowa's cornfields to the halls of power in Washington and Mexico City. This is more than a trade dispute. It's a clash of worldviews, US biotech and free markets versus Mexico's fight for food sovereignty and cultural identity. The phrase, sin maíz no hay país, without corn, there is no country, captures what's at stake for Mexico. As the US and Mexico face off, Canada is quietly capturing a bigger share of Mexico's corn market. The crisis could reshape North American trade for years. We'll break down the history, the science, and the economic fallout, starting with why corn means so much to Mexico. Let's begin with the story of corn itself. To understand this conflict, you must understand what corn, maíz, means to Mexico. Corn isn't just a crop. It's the foundation of Mexican civilization, domesticated nearly 9,000 years ago. It fueled the rise of the Olmecs, Mayans, and Aztecs, and remains central to Mexican identity, especially in the daily tortilla. Mexico is home to at least 59 native corn varieties, each adapted to unique climates and culinary uses. This biodiversity is a national treasure, fiercely protected by indigenous and rural communities. The fight to shield these native strains from GMO cross-pollination is at the heart of Mexico's recent policies. NAFTA, signed in 1994, opened Mexico to a flood of cheap, subsidized U.S. corn, devastating millions of small farmers. This history fueled deep resistance to U.S. agribusiness and its genetically modified products. The fear, economic dependence, and genetic contamination of native corn. Early studies found transgenic DNA in native corn, turning fears into reality. These anxieties set the stage for today's dramatic confrontation. Now, let's see how this dispute escalated into a full-blown trade battle. The standoff has been years in the making. In 2020, Mexico announced a phase-out of glyphosate and GMO corn imports by 2024, shaking the U.S. agricultural sector. Mexico is the top market for U.S. corn, mostly genetically modified, so the threat of a ban was existential for American farmers. Under U.S. pressure, Mexico revised its stance in 2023, allowing GMO corn for animal feed but banning it for tortillas and human food. Mexico cited public health and the precautionary principle, asserting its sovereign right to protect its people and environment. The U.S. argued these restrictions weren't science-based and violated the USMCA trade agreement. In August 2023, the U.S. requested a formal dispute panel under USMCA, escalating the conflict. Mexico's scientific agencies scrambled to justify the ban, citing hundreds of studies on potential risks, like genetic contamination and harm to beneficial insects. For Mexico, this evidence justified caution. For the U.S., it was unproven theory threatening trade. The stage was set for a high-stakes legal showdown. The panel's decision would have major consequences for both nations. Next, we turn to the USMCA panel's verdict. In December 2024, the USMCA panel delivered its verdict, a decisive win for the United States. The panel ruled that Mexico's ban on GMO corn for human consumption wasn't backed by sufficient scientific evidence under the trade agreement. Mexico was ordered to lift its ban on GMO corn for tortillas and food products, putting the government in a tough spot: comply or face U.S. tariffs. Mexico complied, rescinding the import ban for food, but maintaining its ban on GMO corn cultivation and glyphosate. This was a strategic retreat. Mexico met the panel's terms, but kept its core protections in place. The government signaled the fight wasn't over, preparing to take the battle to a higher level. The next move, a constitutional amendment to protect native corn. The conflict was about to escalate from trade law to national identity. Here's how Mexico made its boldest move yet. In March 2025, Mexico's Congress passed a landmark constitutional amendment. It declared native corn a national treasure and banned the cultivation of GMO corn on Mexican soil. This move sidestepped the USMCA ruling, focusing on what's planted, not what's imported. The amendment made the cultivation ban the highest law, nearly impossible to overturn. For activists and scientists, this was the ultimate firewall against genetic contamination. Studies had already found GMO traces in tortillas, proving the risk was real. The amendment also asserted national sovereignty, sending a message some values aren't negotiable. Mexico continues to import U.S. corn for livestock, but its fields are constitutionally protected. This created a unique situation. Mexico is both a top customer for U.S. GMO corn and its fiercest legal opponent. The world was watching as Mexico drew a permanent line in the sand. But as the U.S. and Mexico clashed, another player was quietly gaining ground. Enter Canada. While the U.S. and Mexico battled, Canada seized the opportunity. Mexican buyers, wary of U.S. supply risks, turned north, and Canada's corn exports to Mexico surged. Canada's non-GMO corn sector was especially attractive to Mexican importers seeking alternatives. This shift is redrawing trade routes and strengthening economic ties between Mexico and Canada. Canada, once a minor player, is now a key supplier, directly benefiting from U.S.-Mexico friction. For Mexico, diversifying suppliers reduces vulnerability to U.S. pressure and market shocks. The Canadian supply chain gives Mexico leverage in future negotiations. If U.S. corn becomes too costly or relations sour, Canada is a vital alternative. The corn crisis is now a continental affair, not just a bilateral dispute. This new dynamic is reshaping North American agriculture. The ripple effects are being felt across the continent. The consequences of the corn dispute are rippling across North America. U.S. farmers face anxiety and uncertainty as Mexico's search for new suppliers threatens their dominance. The USMCA ruling preserved market access, but trust has been shaken. Politically, the conflict tests the limits of the USMCA and the balance between trade rules and national sovereignty. Mexico's constitutional amendment is a bold assertion that cultural heritage can outweigh commercial obligations. The world is watching as other nations consider similar moves to protect food sovereignty. In Mexico, the government's stance is celebrated by indigenous groups and activists, but large-scale producers worry about higher costs. The debate has sparked a movement to revive traditional farming and local food systems. In the U.S., the issue is seen mainly as an economic threat, highlighting a disconnect in perspectives. The divide over corn is deepening, with no easy resolution in sight. Experts reveal a fundamental clash between two visions of science and risk. The U.S. and biotech industry argue GMO corn is safe, citing decades of use and regulatory approval. They see Mexico's restrictions as political, not scientific, and a threat to integrated trade. Mexican scientists, led by Dr. Maria Elena Alvarez Buya, argue for caution, pointing to studies on genetic contamination and ecological risks. They say the absence of absolute proof of harm isn't proof of safety. Governments have a duty to act cautiously. Trade analysts like Timothy Wise highlight the collision between binding trade rules and a nation's right to self-determination. The USMCA's narrow definition of science favors industry, dismissing broader environmental and social concerns. The real conflict. Who decides what science matters, and whose interests prevail? The outcome will shape the future of food, farming, and the balance between sovereignty and trade law. The world is watching what happens next. As of October 2025, North America's cornfields are a battleground of trade, culture, and science. The U.S. won a legal victory, but trust with Mexico is damaged. Mexico, while allowing imports, has constitutionally banned GMO corn cultivation, protecting its native varieties. By buying more from Canada, Mexico signals it won't be dependent on a single supplier. The agricultural map is being redrawn, with new winners and losers. The future is uncertain. U.S. farmers face volatility, and Mexico must balance cultural goals with economic needs. The risk of tariffs and further legal battles looms. This dispute over corn exposes deep fissures in North American partnership. What happens next could reshape not just food, but the rules of the global economy. Thanks for watching, share your thoughts below, and good night.